When people talk about Steven Spielberg, they usually talk about wonder. Jurassic Park, E.T., Indiana Jones, but some of Spielberg's most interesting films don't feel magical at all. They feel anxious, cold, paranoid, sometimes even angry. And that's the strange thing about Spielberg's career. The darker his movies get, the less people seem to talk about them. And with Spielberg returning to sci-fi this year with Disclosure Day, people are revisiting this side of his filmography again. So this isn't a ranking of Spielberg's biggest movies. This is about Spielberg's darker, more overlooked films, the ones that don't fit the classic Spielberg image. I'm ranking these by darkness, overlooked status, and how far they sit from the classic Spielberg image. And one of these still contains what might be Spielberg's most stressful scene ever filmed. Let's start with the movie where Spielberg's chaos before control instincts first appeared. 10. The Sugarland Express. This is one of the strangest movies in Spielberg's career because it barely feels like the filmmaker people recognize now. No fantasy, no comforting sense of adventure. It's basically a road movie about panic. The story follows a young couple trying to reclaim custody of their child after the mother escapes prison, only for it to spiral into a statewide police chase. What makes the movie interesting now is the tone. Spielberg shoots the film like the characters are trapped inside momentum they can't stop. Cars piling up behind them, media attention growing, crowds turning the chase into entertainment. And underneath all of it, nobody really seems to know what they're doing. The movie doesn't build toward triumph, it builds towards exhaustion. And because it came out before Jaws changed Spielberg's career, it gets overlooked constantly. But you can already see his tension instincts forming, especially the way he turns movement itself into suspense. Number 9, Duel. This might still be one of Spielberg's purest thrillers. The setup is incredibly simple. A man driving through the desert gets targeted by a truck driver he never fully sees. But Spielberg stretches that idea into something strangely psychological. The truck stops feeling like a vehicle after a while, and it starts feeling personal, almost predatory. And the terrifying part is how ordinary everything looks. A lot of the fear comes from distance, the truck appearing far behind the car, slowly getting closer, staying there longer than it should. And because Spielberg keeps the driver mostly hidden, your brain fills in the blanks itself. What's also fascinating is how confident the direction already feels. This was technically a television film, but scenes like the diner sequence where the main character desperately tries to figure out which man outside could be the driver, it already shows Spielberg fully understanding suspense. Not loud suspense, patient suspense that quietly gets under your skin. If you're into movie deep dives and rankings like this, subscribe, we've got more coming every week. And if you want something more sci-fi after this, we also ranked the best modern sci-fi movies on this channel. Because from here, Spielberg's films stop feeling grounded and start getting emotionally darker. At number 8, Empire of the Sun. This movie feels like Spielberg quietly dismantling his own style. It starts like one of his usual coming-of-age stories, a child fascinated by airplanes and the scale of the world around him. And then the war strips all of that away. The film follows a young British boy separated from his parents during the Japanese invasion of Shanghai. And what makes it darker than most Spielberg films is how slowly innocence disappears from it. Not through one traumatic moment, but piece by piece. Food becomes more important than family. Survival replaces morality. Wonder turns into obsession. And Christian Bale, still a child when this was filmed, carries a huge amount of the movie emotionally, especially the scenes where Jim still tries to hold onto excitement while surrounded by devastation. Spielberg doesn't romanticize war here, he shows how it slowly rewires a child's understanding of the world. And visually, it's one of his most overlooked films. The planes reflected in Jim's eyes, the atomic flash near the end, the airfield sequences, it's Spielberg using beauty in a way that feels unsettling instead of comforting. At At number 7, The Color Purple. This might still be one of the biggest surprises in Spielberg's filmography because there's almost nothing Spielberg-like about it. No spectacle or larger-than-life momentum. It's intimate, painfully intimate actually. The story follows Celie's life across decades of abuse, separation, survival, and eventually self-worth. And Spielberg approaches it with far more restraint than people usually associate with him. That's part of why the movie was misunderstood for years. A lot of people expected Spielberg to direct it loudly. Instead, he directs it carefully. Some of the hardest moments aren't dramatic explosions of emotion. They're quiet humiliations. A look across a dinner table, a letter not arriving, a person slowly realizing how much of life has already been taken from them. And the performances completely carry that weight, especially Whoopi Goldberg, whose performance feels emotionally raw in a way Spielberg's films usually avoid. What makes the movie darker on rewatch is realizing how many years these characters spend simply enduring. And that makes the emotional payoff hit even harder. What's the darkest Spielberg movie for you personally? Not the scariest one, not the one that stays with you afterward. At number 6, Amistad. This is one of the least talked about films Spielberg has ever directed, which is strange because it contains some of the angriest material in his career. The film is based on the real 1839 mutiny aboard the slave ship La Amistad, and instead of approaching it like a historical epic, Spielberg treats much of the story like a moral argument unfolding in public. And that's what makes it uncomfortable. Not just the violence, the way institutions calmly justify it. Courtrooms, politicians, legal language turning human lives into technical debate. Especially because Spielberg doesn't rush through the brutality of the slave ship sequences. They're harsh, claustrophobic, and intentionally difficult to sit through. And unlike some of his more famous historical films, Amistad is slower and more confrontational. Even the victories feel partial, like the system itself is still larger than the people fighting against it, which is probably why the movie gets overlooked so often. It's not inspirational in an easy way. It's exhausting. At number 5, Minority Report. This is Spielberg at his most paranoid. And honestly, the movie feels more relevant now than it did in 2002. The premise revolves around a future system that can predict crimes before they happen, but the real tension comes from how normal everyone treats the system. Nobody questions it anymore. Personal privacy barely exists. Advertisements recognize people by name, the city constantly watches you, and Spielberg shoots all of it with a cold, sterile atmosphere that makes the future feel invasive instead of exciting. Then the movie flips everything around by making John Anderton, the man enforcing the system, suddenly become its target. That's where the tension really locks in. From that point on, the movie barely relaxes. The apartment escape sequence, the jetpack chase, the spider drone scene. This is the scene I teased earlier. The spider drones are one of Spielberg's most stressful sequences. And underneath the thriller structure, the movie keeps asking the same uncomfortable question. What happens when people trust systems more than people? That's why Minority Report holds up so well, because the fear underneath it stopped feeling fictional. And this is the point where Spielberg's darker films stop feeling underrated and start feeling strangely modern. Because the next few movies aren't just emotionally dark, they feel unstable. At number 4, AI, Artificial Intelligence. This is probably the most emotionally unsettling movie Spielberg has ever made. Part of that comes from the fact that it doesn't fully feel like a Spielberg film. The project originally began with Stanley Kubrick, and after Kubrick's death, Spielberg completed it himself. You can feel both filmmakers pulling at the movie constantly. Spielberg brings the emotional vulnerability, Kubrick's influence brings the coldness. The story follows David, a robotic child programmed to love his human mother. And the darker the movie gets, the more disturbing that idea becomes. Because David can't stop loving, even when he's abandoned or unwanted. That's what makes the film hit differently on rewatch. As a kid, it feels sad. As an adult, it feels existential, especially the abandonment scene in the forest. Spielberg shoots it quietly, which somehow makes it worse. Just a child realizing he's being left behind. And then the movie keeps getting stranger. The flesh fair sequences feel almost dystopian. The future world feels emotionally empty instead of technologically exciting. Even the ending becomes much darker once you think about what David actually wants. Not survival, not freedom, just one more moment with someone who loved him. At number 3, War of the Worlds. This movie feels like panic. A lot of invasion movies build toward excitement or heroism. This one builds toward collapse. And Spielberg keeps the camera close to ordinary people while everything falls apart around them. That's what makes it different. The alien attack sequences aren't framed like spectacle. They're framed like confusion. Dust filling the streets, people running without understanding what's happening, crowds turning dangerous almost immediately. The ferry scene still feels stressful every time you watch it. And the basement sequence with Tim Robbins is one of the most claustrophobic things Spielberg has ever directed. What really changed the way people see this movie over time is the post-9/11 atmosphere hanging over it. The ash-covered survivors, the missing person walls, the feeling that everyday life can collapse instantly. Spielberg never says it directly, you can just feel it in almost every frame. And unlike most blockbuster sci-fi movies from that era, War of the Worlds barely gives the audience relief. It just keeps pushing forward. Tired people trying to survive something bigger than them. It's not really about aliens, it's about fear spreading faster than logic. What Spielberg movie do you think people completely misunderstood when it first came out? Because AI and War of the Worlds both feel very different now than they did on release. And the top 2 films are where Spielberg's darkness stop feeling personal and start feeling political. At number 2, Bridge of Spies. This is one of the quietest movies Spielberg has ever directed, and that's exactly why it works. On the surface, it barely sounds like a dark Spielberg film at all. A lawyer negotiating a Cold War prisoner exchange doesn't exactly scream tension. But the movie slowly turns paranoia into atmosphere. Everything feels restrained, controlled, measured. People choose words carefully. Governments move cautiously. Nobody fully trusts anyone. And Spielberg leans into that discomfort instead of making the story flashy. Even the Berlin sequences feel cold in a very literal way. Gray streets, silent checkpoints, walls dividing entire lives. There's one moment that quietly explains the whole film. When Tom Hanks' character keeps asking the captured spy if he's worried, and the spy calmly responds, "Would it help?" That line changes the tone of the movie, because suddenly it stops being about espionage mechanics and becomes about emotional survival inside systems that don't care about individuals. And what makes Bridge of Spies underrated is how patient it is. Most thrillers force tension aggressively. Spielberg lets silence create it. At number 1, Munich, and honestly, this might be the darkest film Spielberg has ever made. Not because it's violent, because it becomes morally exhausting. The movie follows a covert Israeli team assigned to assassinate individuals connected to the 1972 Munich Olympics massacre. But Spielberg refuses to frame the mission like a revenge fantasy. That's what makes the film uncomfortable. Every assassination creates more paranoia, more fear, and uncertainty. Nobody involved starts feeling safer. They just become more isolated. And Spielberg shoots the film with a constant sense of instability. Hotel rooms never feel secure. Conversations feel interrupted. Even successful missions feel wrong somehow. The tension isn't built around will they succeed, it's built around what is this doing to them. That's why the movie lingers with people, especially on rewatch. You already know what happens, so instead you start noticing the emotional damage building scene by scene. The group becoming quieter, more suspicious, less human. By the end, Spielberg leaves the audience in a place where revenge thrillers avoid completely: uncertainty. No clean victory, no emotional release, just the feeling that violence keeps reproducing itself faster than anyone can control it. And that final shot, with the Twin Towers visible in the background, reframes the movie one last time. Not as history, as warning. As warning. That's what makes Spielberg's darker films so fascinating. They don't feel dark in a performative way. They feel dark because they're interested in what fear actually does to people. And that's probably why so many of these films stay underrated. They're harder to revisit than the adventure movies, but they stay with you longer. And with Spielberg returning to sci-fi this year, it's interesting seeing how many of these darker films still feel ahead of their time. And if you want more sci-fi after this, we also rank the best modern sci-fi movies on the channel, definitely worth checking out next. Which Spielberg movie do you think deserves way more attention than it gets? Because Spielberg's most unforgettable movies usually aren't the safest ones.